It is roughly 12,000 years ago. You are dead. This is already inconvenient. But apparently your family has identified an even bigger problem. What if there are fish in the afterlife, and you arrive without a hook? So while your body is placed into a shallow grave beneath a limestone rock shelter on an island that we now call Alor, someone carefully places fishing equipment near your head. Not food, not gold, not a sword, not a tiny prehistoric certificate confirming that you were excellent at fishing. Fish hooks. 5 of them. One lies beneath your chin. Several others rest around your jaw. Beside them is a perforated shell. Nearby are stones stained with red ochre. And then the grave is covered. Thousands of years pass. The shoreline changes. Generations disappear. Languages are born and die. Nobody remembers your name. And eventually archaeologists dig down through the floor of the rock shelter and discover something that should make you reconsider what the phrase Stone Age technology actually means. Because these aren't crude little pieces of rock someone accidentally bent into a vaguely useful shape. They're carefully manufactured shell fishing hooks. And their presence in a grave tells us something much stranger than simply ancient people liked fish. It suggests that, for at least one maritime community, fishing may have been important enough to follow you beyond death. Welcome to Alor Island, and congratulations. You may have just died with the prehistoric equivalent of packing your fishing gear for eternity. Picture the island first. You are living in what is now eastern Indonesia, in a region of islands scattered between larger landmasses. Alor is mountainous, volcanic, and surrounded by sea. It was never simply attached to the great continental landmasses nearby by a convenient dry walkway, which means that human life here was tied to water from the beginning. The sea isn't scenery. The sea is your supermarket, your highway, your weather forecast, your neighbor, and occasionally, the enormous blue thing trying to kill you because you decided a tiny piece of shell and some string were sufficient equipment for obtaining dinner. At the Tronbonle rock shelter, where this burial was found, archaeologists recovered an astonishing quantity of marine remains. In one excavation pit alone, identified animal bone was overwhelmingly fish. That matters, because if you live somewhere filled with deer, pigs, cattle, wheat fields, and suspiciously cooperative chickens, fishing can be a hobby. Here, fishing could be survival. Imagine waking before sunrise. There's no refrigerator, no supermarket, no freezer full of emergency pizza. If you want protein tomorrow, someone has to go and get it today. And the ocean does not operate a customer service desk. You need knowledge. Where do fish gather? Which species bite? When do currents change? Which bait works? How strong does your line need to be? Where are the reefs? How do you avoid losing your hook? How do you make another one after you lose it anyway? Because, apparently, fish have been stealing expensive equipment for at least 12,000 years. Fishing isn't just put hook in water, become chef. It requires accumulated information. And that is where the hooks from the grave become really interesting. 4 of the surviving hooks have a circular, rotating form. They curve inward so tightly that, to modern eyes, you might look at one and think, that cannot possibly work. Excellent. People have been criticizing fishing equipment without understanding it for a very long time. These rotating hooks operate differently from the familiar J-shaped hook. With a J-shaped hook, the fisher often has to pull sharply when the fish bites. With a rotating hook, the curved shape can turn as the fish takes the bait and moves away, helping the hook secure itself inside the fish's mouth. In other words, ancient people had already discovered a version of, let the fish make the mistake for you. And these hooks weren't made from metal. There is no little prehistoric hardware store where you walk in and ask for 6 stainless steel hooks, medium size, preferably with free delivery. They're made from shell. Specifically, the rotating examples were manufactured from the shell of a large marine snail. That means somebody had to obtain the shell, shape it, grind it, polish it, and produce something thin enough to function as fishing equipment, but strong enough not to immediately snap when an angry fish discovered it had made a terrible lunchtime decision. One hook even preserves marks suggesting that the outer shell layer was deliberately removed, exposing the shiny nacre beneath. Researchers have suggested that this lustrous surface may have helped attract fish. So yes, more than 11,000 years ago, Somebody may have been improving their lure by making it shiny. Apparently, fish have also been falling for unnecessary decorative upgrades longer than humans have. Now return to the grave. Because this is the part that gets strange. The hooks weren't simply found somewhere in the rock shelter. People lived there, people ate there, people worked there. Finding a fishing hook in such a place would be interesting, but not shocking. Finding one associated with a burial is different. The researchers excavating Tron Bonlay found an intact hook and a perforated bivalve directly beneath the individual's chin. 3 more hooks were positioned around the lower jaw. A partial 5th hook was found beneath it. That placement makes accidental association much harder to dismiss. Someone seems to have intentionally included fishing gear with the dead. And this burial is ancient enough to be extraordinary. The researchers described the Alor hooks as the oldest known fish hooks associated with mortuary practices anywhere in the world. That doesn't mean these are the world's oldest fishing hooks. Humans had been making hooks before this. Shell hooks from Okinawa have been found in layers roughly 20 to 23,000 years old. And early fishing technology appears elsewhere in island Southeast Asia. The unusual thing here is death. Someone took useful fishing technology and put it into a grave. Think about what that costs. You don't live in an industrial economy. Objects aren't infinitely replaceable. A carefully made hook represents material, labor, skill, and time. And instead of handing it to another living fisher, your community places it beside someone who is never coming back to use it. At least, not in this world. And that's where archaeology reaches the edge of what it can actually tell us. We know the hooks were there. We know the burial was ancient. We know fishing was extremely important at the site. But nobody left a note saying, "Dear archaeologists of the future, these hooks are included because Sandra plans to catch celestial tuna. So we have to be careful." Archaeologists can describe the objects. They can date them. They can study where they were positioned. They can compare them with other sites. But intentions do not fossilize. Maybe the hooks represented the person's identity. Maybe they were tools for another world. Maybe they marked social status. Maybe they were gifts. Maybe fishing itself had ritual or spiritual significance. Maybe several of those ideas were true at the same time. And there is another fascinating detail. The skeleton wasn't completely excavated, which means archaeologists could not determine the person's sex with absolute confidence. But features of the skull suggested the individual was probably an adult woman. That immediately makes the burial even more interesting, because modern popular images of prehistory have a terrible habit of dividing ancient life into something like men hunt mammoth, women stand near cave holding basket. Everyone else apparently does nothing until agriculture is invented. Actual human societies are considerably less cooperative with simple cartoons. The Alor burial doesn't prove that women were the primary fishers in this community. It doesn't even let us prove that this individual personally used these hooks. But it absolutely prevents us from casually assuming that sophisticated fishing technology belonged only to men. In fact, the researchers point to ethnographic examples from Australia, where circular hooks of comparable design were made and used by women. That does not mean Alor followed the same tradition. Different culture, different place, different time. But it does mean that when you see prehistoric fishing equipment, attaching an imaginary bearded man to it automatically is not archaeology. It is casting. Now imagine the person before the burial. Not as a skeleton, not as specimen, as a human being. Maybe you wake before daylight. You know the coastline better than a modern commuter knows the road to work. You can read the water. You know whether a place that looks empty actually contains food. You know what material makes a strong line. You know how to prepare a hook. You know what happens when the wind changes. You probably possess hundreds of pieces of practical information that would be almost completely invisible in the archaeological record. Nobody can excavate your memory of a reef. Nobody finds fossilized instructions for tying a line. Knowledge disappears when people do. Unless they teach someone else. That is the hidden technology behind the hook. The shell survives. The expertise doesn't. And there is something especially fitting about finding these objects near the person's head. We cannot know whether they were originally tied together, worn, placed deliberately around the neck, or arranged in some other way that changed as the body decomposed. But ethnographic examples show that spare hooks could sometimes be worn around the neck. Again, That does not prove this person wore these particular hooks in life, but it gives us an eerie possibility. Perhaps what archaeologists found wasn't simply equipment beside a corpse. Perhaps they were looking at something once carried close to the body, something familiar, something useful, something personal. Imagine your family preparing the burial. Someone takes your fishing gear. They could keep it. They could use it tomorrow. Instead, they put it with you. That decision means something. We just don't get to hear the explanation. Nearby were two flat stones coated with red ochre. Red ochre appears in many prehistoric contexts around the world, sometimes associated with bodies, ritual activity, or symbolic behavior. But we should resist the temptation to turn every red prehistoric object into evidence of a secret ceremony involving moonlight and 20 people chanting dramatically. Archaeology has enough problems without us directing the movie adaptation. What matters here is the combination. A deliberately buried body, fishing equipment, a perforated shell that showed wear and traces of red coloring, ochre-coated stones, a community intensely dependent on marine resources. Put those things together, and the grave begins to feel less like disposal and more like treatment. Someone cared what went into that grave, and perhaps they cared because fishing wasn't simply an occupation. On an island where marine resources formed the foundation of life, fishing could structure the way people understood themselves. Think about modern identity. Ask someone, "What do you do?" And they might answer, "I'm a teacher. I'm a farmer. I'm a soldier. I'm a carpenter. I'm a fisherman." Occupations become identities because they organize your day, your skills, your relationships, your reputation, and your place in a community. Now remove modern jobs, remove money, remove paperwork, remove LinkedIn, which is probably the strongest evidence that civilization sometimes moves backward. If your ability to extract food from the ocean helps keep your community alive, fishing isn't just what you do between breakfast and dinner. Fishing helps make you who you are. So perhaps burying someone with hooks wasn't strange at all. Perhaps not including them would have been strange. Imagine being buried without the objects that represented the most important part of your life. 12,000 years from now, an archaeologist opens your grave. No phone, no coffee mug, no laptop. This person clearly had no culture. You would haunt them out of professional irritation. And then there is the possibility that the hooks were meant for use beyond death. The original researchers cautiously suggested that the association between burial and fishing gear may indicate that fishing had a cosmological importance for this community, possibly even that fishing equipment was considered important for the transition into an afterlife. We cannot prove that, but imagine the logic from inside the community rather than from outside it. If death is a journey, you need supplies. If ancestors continue existing somewhere, they may need the things that defined life here. If the world beyond death resembles this one in any way, arriving without fishing equipment would be a spectacular planning failure. Congratulations, you survived childhood. You survived disease. You survived storms. You survived years of fishing in dangerous water. You crossed the boundary between life and death. And now you're standing on the shore of eternity with absolutely no hook. Your ancestors look at you. You look at the fish. Somebody finally asks, "So, what exactly did your family pack?" "Nothing." "Excellent." Eternal starvation caused by poor funeral preparation. Suddenly the hooks make sense, but there is another reason this discovery matters. Ancient coastlines are archaeological nightmares. At the end of the Ice Age, rising sea levels drowned enormous areas of former coastline around the world. Places where people once camped, collected shellfish, launched boats or fished may now sit underwater. That means our picture of ancient coastal life is biased. The ocean stole part of the archive, and unlike a museum curator, it did not label the boxes. This helps explain why burials of this age from ancient maritime settings are so rare. So when Tron Bonlay gives us a grave containing fishing technology, we are seeing something that probably happened in a much larger world of coastal behavior that has mostly disappeared. One burial survives, one person, 5 hooks, and suddenly an entire relationship between humans and the sea becomes visible. Even the shape of the hooks tells a larger story. Very similar rotating hooks later appear in widely separated parts of the world. It would be tempting to imagine one genius prehistoric fisherman inventing the design and then a global network of extremely committed anglers spreading it across oceans. But the researchers warn against automatically assuming that similar tools must have spread from one culture to another. Sometimes humans independently invent similar solutions because they're facing similar problems. A fish is a fish. A current is a current. A badly designed hook is still a badly designed hook. Put different humans beside different oceans, and give them enough generations of losing dinner, and eventually somebody may curve the shell in a useful way. This is technological convergence, and I love it because it makes prehistoric humans feel incredibly familiar. They're experimenting. They're modifying equipment. They're noticing what works. They're throwing away what doesn't. Somebody probably made a terrible hook. Somebody probably laughed at it. Somebody almost certainly insisted their terrible design was actually better. Humanity had already been humanity for a very long time. But the grave adds something technology alone cannot. It adds emotion. Objects placed with the dead are rarely just objects once they enter that context. A fish hook lying beside a cooking fire tells you someone fished. A fish hook placed beside a dead person makes you ask, who were they? What did fishing mean to them? Why did someone decide they should keep this? And perhaps the most frustrating answer in archaeology is also the most important one. We don't know. We can reconstruct probabilities. We can eliminate some bad explanations. We can compare contexts, but we cannot interview the funeral party. Maybe these hooks belonged to the person. Maybe they symbolized her place in the community. Maybe relatives believed she would need them somewhere else. Maybe placing them beside her was an act of grief. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was love. Maybe somebody stood beside that grave 12,000 years ago, holding a polished shell hook and thinking about all the mornings when the person buried below had walked toward the water. And then they let it go. That moment leaves almost nothing behind, except the hook, which is why this tiny object is so powerful. A pyramid screams at you across history. A giant temple refuses to be ignored. A shellfish hook does the opposite. It's small, easy to overlook, almost ridiculous. But sometimes the smallest objects tell you the most intimate things. Not which king conquered which city, not which empire taxed which province, but what ordinary humans considered important enough to carry into death. And on Allure, the answer seems to have included the sea. Fishing, skill, identity, possibly belief, maybe even the expectation that death was not the end of practical problems, because apparently even in eternity, someone still has to catch dinner. So the next time you imagine prehistoric humans as people stumbling around with rocks, remember the grave beneath the Tron Bonlay rock shelter. Remember the carefully shaped shell hooks. Remember the polished surfaces. Remember the rotating design that could exploit the movement of the fish itself. Remember the person buried beside them. And remember that 12,000 years ago, people weren't just surviving. They were making sophisticated tools, passing down specialized knowledge, creating identities, mourning their dead, and possibly wondering what those dead would need wherever they were going next. Which leaves us with one beautifully human thought. We still bury people with meaningful things: wedding rings, photographs, letters, medals, objects they loved. The materials changed. The emotions probably didn't. And somewhere beneath an ancient rock shelter on an Indonesian island, 5 little fish hooks survived long enough to remind us that the distance between their world and ours might be much smaller than 12,000 years makes it sound, especially if the afterlife has fish. In that case, they were simply better prepared. If you enjoy stories where one tiny archaeological discovery opens a doorway into an entire forgotten human world, subscribe, because history gets much stranger when you stop looking only at kings, wars, and monuments, and start asking why somebody thought a dead person still needed a fishing hook.